Somebody asked why it is that the priest takes a particle of the consecrated host and places it in the chalice, the blood of Christ. Where did that come from? There's another practice that a lot of people will ask about too, and that is, why does the priest pour a little bit of water into the wine before it is consecrated at the preparation of the gifts? And both of those have an ancient practice behind them. Actually, the practice of placing a little bit of water into wine came out of a practice that would happen at most tables in the Greek world, because the wine was a rather strong and a little bit gritty, and therefore to flavor it, or to diminish the strength of it, and then also to get rid of some of the grittiness of it, they would pour some water into the wine. The Romans picked up that practice from the Greeks and continued it, and then basically it came into the liturgy too as a practice of cutting the strength of the wine down a little bit, and that was the practical purpose behind it. Now, after a while, when people would even forget some of the practical purposes behind it, they would spiritualize the reason for it. And so the spiritual reason that was added to it, and it's reflective in the prayer that the priest actually prays quietly at that time, is about the divinity and the humanity, the great exchange of divinity and humanity in the person of Jesus Christ. And so that just as Jesus, who is divine, became human, so we who are human, through the Spirit of Christ, we become more and more divine in all of its fullness, obviously in the afterlife. So that became the spiritualization of that, and that's the prayer, that just as Christ became human for our sake, so we are taken up into his divinity. The practice of taking a little piece of the consecrated bread and placing it into the wine goes back to a time when bishops, who were basically the priest for a household or a small group of households, and he would oversee them. After some time, as the church was growing, and especially as it went out into the countryside, they wanted to express the unity with the bishop, and one of the ways in which they expressed that was by taking a particle of host in a vessel to one of the priest's masses out in the countryside, and the priest would then, in the course of the mass at the time before communion, would take a little bit of that particle from the bishop's mass and place it in his own chalice as a sign of the unity between those communities and between the bishop who is celebrating mass with a household and with the priests out in the countryside that were celebrating mass. After a while, as the church grew so expansively, it was impossible for that to happen, and so the priests themselves would take a piece of the consecrated bread that they had consecrated and place it in the chalice, and that too became spiritualized. And the idea behind it was twofold. One is that it was demonstrating. In fact, sometimes what would happen is that a priest would take a particle from the host from a previous mass and add it to the chalice in a mass that would take place afterwards, as a sign of the continual sacrificial aspect of Christ's once and for all sacrifice that takes place in continual masses. So that was one of the spiritualizations of that. And the other was the fact that Jesus' humanity and his divinity were one, and that even after his death, there was still humanity and divinity joined together by the fact of the body and blood of Christ that had been shed at his crucifixion, now is joined together as a sign of his resurrection, that he doesn't lose his humanity even in his resurrection. And so that was symbolized by placing a bit of the consecrated bread into the consecrated wine. Along with that particular question came a question about what happens to a priest's chalice after they pass away. And it has been customary for the priest either to give over that chalice to his own family, to keep, so his sisters or brothers or nephews or nieces, or more often it would be given to one of the churches that he was pastor in, or it could be given to a younger priest that may have become a friend of that older priest, and he would pass the chalice on to him. But that's what is customary usually with a chalice that the priest has used and passed on after his own death.